Today's story comes from Scotland. It's a fairy story, and that means there are fairies in it, but perhaps not the kind of fairies that you might have heard of. This race of fairies are called the Sidhe. And if you were to see them in the street, you wouldn't know that they were the Sidhe, because they look like humans, they have dark hair. Only if you could maybe catch a look at one of their ears and see how pointed their ears are, then you would know that this could be a member of the Sidhe. So one day, two women of the Sidhe were walking along the cliff top. It was a very high cliff, and it was a sunny day, and suddenly they stopped in their tracks because ahead of them on the path there was a small bundle of something. When they came closer, they saw it was moving, and closer still, there was a sound coming from that bundle, like a crying, mewling kind of sound. They bent down, pulled back the cover. It was a baby, a human baby. They looked behind them on the path. There was nobody there. There was nobody in front either. To the side, it was just the moor and the trees, and the other side was the cliff and the sea. There was nobody in sight. So one woman looked at the other and she said, "Finders keepers." And they picked up the baby and they rushed off and were gone. At the same time, out on the sea, two fishermen were just turning their boat back towards the village where they came from. But one of them thought he'd seen something strange just a little bit down from the edge of the cliff, and managed to persuade the other to go in to take the boat in a little bit closer so they could see. Now, it was risky because of the rocks, but they had to see if somebody was in some kind of danger or had been hurt. When they came close enough, they saw that sure enough, someone had fallen and was lying now completely still on a sort of shelf just a bit down from the top of the cliff. They managed to climb up and lift down the body and place her, for it was a young woman, in the boat, and they took her as fast as they could back to the village. She wasn't dead. She wasn't harmed physically so much, but she was very dazed. And it was a couple of days before she completely came to and could speak. And the first words she said were, "Where's my baby?" The women looked at one another and said to her, "My dear, we found no baby. Perhaps when you fell, he dropped. Perhaps he slipped." But she said, "No, I put him down safely on the path. I just went to look for some water for him. He was safe. I have to go now." And she tried to get up, and the women said, "You can't go now. You're too weak. Look, we'll send the men to look." The men went looking. They walked all the way up and down that path, but there was no sign of the baby. And secretly, everybody really believed that the baby had fallen down the cliff and was gone. But the young woman would have none of it. She was certain that the baby had been safe, and she started to search for him. She asked everybody in the village. She asked everybody in the neighbouring crofts and farms, and nobody had seen anything of this child. Nobody knew anything about it. For days, without stopping, she searched and she walked until she came to a group of gypsies who were camping. And they said, "All the children here, these are our children, but sit here and rest a bit." And they bathed her feet, and they brought her food, and they tried to comfort her. She was very, very upset. They said, "Look, in a few days, we are traveling to a gathering where there are many and many of our people coming together from across the country. Why don't you stay with us? Because there's an old woman. She's the wisest of all of us. Come and meet her. Maybe she can help you." So the young woman stayed with the gypsies, travelled with them, and a few days later was taken to meet this old gypsy woman. The old lady heard her story, took her hand and sat her down, and the two of them sat beside a fire all evening in silence. At midnight, the old woman picked up a bunch of herbs and threw them suddenly on the fire. And a special perfume and smoke came up off the fire and enveloped her. And then she said to the young woman, "I'm sorry, you must give up your search because your baby has been taken by the Sidhe. And what the Sidhe take, they never give back." The young woman said, "Can't you give me some kind of magic, some kind of help, some kind of spell, so I can get the baby back?" The old lady said, "My magic is only as old as human beings, but the Sidhe, well, they are as old as the world, and there is nothing that I have that could possibly protect you against them." And the young woman began to cry bitterly and said, "If I can't have my baby, I may as well lay down here and die." And the old woman said, "Look, stay here with us until we leave in a few days' time. Perhaps by then I will have thought of something." So a few days later, just before all the gypsies were moving out in different directions, the old lady again met with a young woman. And she said, "I have an idea. The Sidhe are about to gather for a special meeting. They're going to choose who will be their king for the next 100 years. If you could manage to get into that meeting, perhaps you could bargain with them. Perhaps you can get your child out." "With what can I bargain?" said the young woman. "I don't have anything." The old lady said, "Well, the Sidhe have a weakness for rare and beautiful things. They'll give almost anything to have something that there's only one of, something really special. If you could get hold of something like that, maybe you can barter with them." Well, with that, the young woman said goodbye and started to walk back towards the area she came from, to where the cliff was. And she walked on the beaches and she was thinking about what on earth she could give that the Sidhe would be interested in, that they would want, because she was poor. She didn't have anything. And she asked herself, and again, what special, wonderful, unique thing could they want? And she remembered a story about a harp, a special harp that when it was played was so beautiful. It was unique. And she thought to herself, maybe I could make a harp like that. She also thought of something else she'd heard of a cloak, a magical cloak. She thought, maybe I could make that. So this is what she did. She went down onto a place in the beach where there were a lot of eider ducks and feathers laying around, and she gathered many, many, many feathers. And when she had enough, she wove them together into this beautiful, soft cloak. It was so light, it was like a cloud. And then she took some of her own hair. She cut her hair and she used some of her hair. It was golden, and she threaded and made patterns in the edge of the cloak that looked like flowers and shapes and stars. And when it was finished, it really was exquisite. And then also on the beach, she found the bones of seabirds and animals that had been bleached by the sun. And she worked with them, and she worked with them until she created the most extraordinary small harp. And she took more of her hair, and she used her hair to string the harp. And then when she played it, it was amazing the sound it made. So these two items she packed carefully in a bag on her back. And she set off. Now the old woman had told her where the Sidhe were meeting. It was called the Shaheen, a kind of hillside. And she realized she needed two things, because she needed one to get in and another thing to barter to get her baby out. So she stood and hid behind some trees and watched all the Sidhe going into the Shaheen. And then at the end, just as she had hoped, there was one Sidhe woman who was late. So just as she was coming up to the entrance to the Shaheen, the young woman jumped out and threw the cloth down on the path. And the Sidhe woman was surprised to see a human, said, "What are you doing here?" But then she saw the cloak and she wanted it. She said, "How much for it?" The young woman said, "It's not for sale. I'll give you anything you want. How much gold do you want?" "I don't want gold." "What do you want then?" said the Sidhe woman. "Take me inside the Shaheen to the gathering." When the fairy woman saw that she couldn't barter with anything else, she agreed. She said, "First give me the cloak." "No, first you take me inside." "First the cloak." "No, first inside." So it was agreed. And so, taking her by the arm, the Sidhe woman walked her into the Shaheen. And as soon as they were inside, she snatched the cloak and she shook it out like this. And of course, as soon as the rest of the Sidhe saw that cloak, they all wanted to touch it. They all wanted to try it on. They all wanted to feel it. And in all of that activity, the young woman managed to slip past them and into the main chamber. And there she saw, sitting at the end, the king on a throne. And she went up to him. And he said, "What are you doing in here? A human, why are you here?" She said, "You have something of mine." "We have something of yours?" "What?" said the king. "But let me show you what I have first." And she took out the harp. The king leaned forward, and then she played on it. She just played 3 or 4 notes, and the sound was completely exquisite. The king of the Sidhe said, "How much do you want for that?" She said, "It's not for sale." He said, "Of course it is. Everything is for sale." And he had a huge pile of gold put down on the ground in front of her. And he said, "Here, take all of that. Just give me it." She said, "I said it's not for sale, but I will barter." "Barter," he said, "for what?" She said, "2 of your Sidhe women took my baby. You can have this harp. I want my baby." Now the king had actually intended to keep that baby for himself. So he tried instead to offer her jewels, diamonds and emeralds on top of the gold. And she said, "The baby." "The harp first," said the king. "The baby first," she said. "The harp first, the baby first." "The harp first," said the king. "The baby first." Because she knew if once she handed over that harp, she would never see the baby. So then the baby was brought. And as soon as he saw his mother, he lifted up his little arms and reached out towards her. So she took the baby, and the king snatched the harp, and she was out of there in a flash. And she carried him safely in her arms, away from the Shaheen, and down all the way back to the fishing village. And there she lived with him happily and at peace for the rest of her days. So have you ever seen a fairy? Have you ever seen anybody with pointed ears? What do you think of the story? Write me a comment.